Keil Kraft employed 200 workers in Wickford, Essex, and sold 1 million model aircraft kits worldwide. They taught a generation of British boys what cellulose dope smelled like, and what happened when you rushed the work. The tissue wrinkled, the wing warped, and your model didn't fly. Then the founder was killed on the A127. The chief designer had already left. The half-brother who inherited the company later ran a double glazing firm. The brand passed to a distributor in West Sussex, then to a retail chain that opened 47 shops and collapsed, then to a wholesaler who relaunched 6 classic kits for the nostalgia market. The factory is now a warehouse. The workers' bungalows, named Ajax and Achilles after the models, still stand on Russell Gardens. Nobody living in them knows why there is no plaque. This is the story of Eddie Keil, a cabinet maker's grandson who hung model aircraft from the ceiling of a furniture workshop in Shoreditch and built the company that put British boys' first understanding of flight into a cardboard box sold for pocket money. Not through one disaster. Through a slow accumulation of absences, until the saws stopped and the balsa dust settled and nobody came in on Monday. Chapter 1. The Cabinet Maker's Grandson. The story begins not in Essex, but in Hesse, a district in central Germany where, around 1844, a boy named Henry Keil was born into a family of woodworkers. Cabinet making was his trade and his inheritance. Sometime before 1864, Henry left Germany for London's East End, married Julia Domney in Hackney that September, and set about building a life among the crowded workshops and furniture yards of Victorian Shoreditch. By 1878, he'd been naturalised as a British citizen. By the 1881 census, he was a 37-year-old cabinet maker, one of thousands in that part of London, but one who carried a surname that would, 2 generations later, appear on more than 1 million cardboard boxes stacked in model shops from Aberdeen to Auckland. His son, Edward Keil Sr., born in Bethnal Green in 1881, continued the craft. He became a maker of reproduction furniture, skilled, patient work that required an intimate understanding of wood grain, joinery and finish. He married 3 times, fathered several sons and established a workshop on Hackney Road, Shoreditch. It was a modest operation in a neighbourhood of modest operations. Nothing about it suggested aviation. But wood has a way of leading you places. Edward Sr.'s workshop sat at the heart of London's furniture-making quarter. Streets where men understood timber at the level of the cell, where they could feel the difference between a plank cut with the grain and one cut against it, where the weight of a piece in the hand told you everything about its fitness for purpose. This was craft knowledge passed through generations, absorbed through fingertips rather than textbooks. And it was this knowledge, not any grand commercial vision, that would prove fateful. Edward Sr.'s most significant son was another Edward. Eddie Keil, born in Bethnal Green in the early 1900s, the exact year still disputed between records, grew up above that Hackney Road workshop surrounded by wood shavings and the sweet, resinous smell of freshly cut timber. He attended Eardley Road School. He married Rosina Davy in Bethnal Green in 1933. And at some point in his youth, he discovered model aircraft. A neighbour's son, born in 1935, later recalled being carried as a small boy to the Hackney Road workshop. His father would chat with Eddie while the child stared upward at the large array of rubber-driven model aircraft suspended from the ceiling. Not a sideline, not a display. A ceiling full of flying machines hanging above the workbenches of a furniture shop in Shoreditch. That image, balsa wings turning slowly in the draft above the lathes, is the origin of everything that followed. Eddie wasn't just a hobbyist who made things. He was a competition aeromodeler. He flew his own designs. He understood thrust lines and wing camber and the maddening sensitivity of a rubber-powered model to the slightest imbalance. And he understood something else, something commercial, that thousands of boys across Britain wanted to build these things but had no reliable source of well-designed kits. The market, in the late 1930s, was dominated by scratch building from magazine plans. Buying a complete kit was, as one historian of the hobby put it, quite a luxury. Then the war came, and with it a connection that would change everything. Edward Keil Sr., Eddie's father, went to work on the production line for the de Havilland Mosquito. The legendary fighter bomber was built largely from plywood and balsa wood, a military aircraft that depended on the same craft knowledge that had sustained the Keil family for 3 generations. The Mosquito was proof that wood could fly, not as a toy, but as one of the fastest, most versatile aircraft of the war. Father and son now inhabited the same intersection: traditional woodworking and the dream of flight. Eddie visited America. The exact date and circumstances are lost. No diary survives, no itinerary, no photograph of the trip. But its influence was decisive. He returned with the conviction that balsa wood model aircraft kits could be manufactured and sold commercially at scale, not as luxuries for dedicated hobbyists, but as affordable, well-designed products for the mass market. Britain had the demand. Britain had 500,000 model flyers and over 500 clubs by 1945. What Britain lacked was a reliable supplier who understood both wood and flight. Eddie Keil understood both. He'd grown up with the first and chosen the second. Now, he married them. Chapter 2. Wedge Strength. The name he chose was a quiet act of confidence. Keil, the family surname, means wedge or wooden peg in German. Kraft is German for strength or force. Keelcraft. Wedge strength. A bilingual pun that combined his family's German origin name with a German word conveying power and capability. That Eddie chose a German-sounding brand name during or shortly after the Second World War speaks to something, perhaps confidence, perhaps indifference to the association, or perhaps the simple recognition that for a family 3 generations into English life, the German connection was heritage, not identity. E. Keil and Company was formally established around 1946. The first Keelcraft handbook appeared that year, part catalogue, part instruction manual, part manifesto for a hobby that was about to explode. The first major kits were the Ajax and the Junior 60, and the men Eddie hired to design them would define the company for the next 2 decades. Albert Edward Hatfull was 20 years old when he joined Keil Kraft. Born in London in 1926 into a family of engineers and seafarers, he'd been building American import model kits since the age of 9, Mego and Cellulose, the transatlantic standards. He'd studied mathematics and draftsmanship at Tottenham Technical College. He had a deep, intuitive understanding of aerodynamics. And in 1942, aged 16, he'd contracted polio from a local swimming pool. The disease permanently restricted the mobility in his hands. It didn't stop him. His first design for Keelcraft was the Invader glider, named for the wartime moment, featuring a distinctive twin-fin tail that made it instantly recognisable on any flying field. It became a bestseller and the definitive beginner's model. He then created the Junior 60 before his 20th birthday, as he later recalled, while the V2s were falling on London. Hatfull went on to become the most important creative force in Keelcraft's history. The Ajax Mark II, his redesign of an earlier Louis Heath original, would sell approximately 1 million kits. 1 million. That single design, a 30-inch free-flight rubber duration model built around the SMAE fuselage specification, may be the most commercially successful individual balsa model kit ever produced. His Senator, a contest-style rubber duration model with a single wheel for minimum weight, was described as possibly the most successful rubber model that has ever been sold in kit form. His Skyscraper featured an innovative undercambered lifting fuselage. His Falcon stretched to a massive 96-inch span for large engines. He designed the company's triangular trademark logo. By all accounts, he was a colourful presence, fond of New Orleans jazz, a close follower of the American model aircraft scene, a pianist, and a man whose polio-damaged hands produced drawings of extraordinary precision. But Hatfull wasn't alone. Bill Dean joined the company in 1946, fresh from RAF service in Rhodesia, where he'd instructed on Harvards. Dean had started at Aeromodeler magazine aged 16 in 1939, working alongside the legendary Ron Waring. His designs had a distinctive flair. His competitor was among the first Keil Kraft kits, his Super Slicker. Astonished spectators with its powerful climb at the British Nationals of 1947, and was immediately kitted. His Gypsy, a 40-inch rubber model, was named by Eddie Keil himself as a joke about Dean's bohemian appearance, the long hair and sandals of a man who looked more like a jazz musician than an aircraft designer. Dean was also a pioneer of GTEx-powered models. JetX micro-rocket motors, tiny solid fuel engines that produced a jet of hot gas, had been invented by Wilmot and Mansour and launched in June 1948. Dean's Skyjet series appeared just 5 months later, in November. By 1952, the range included a flying saucer. The space race was arriving, and Keil Kraft was ready for it. The third pillar was Ernie Webster, who joined in 1946 at 22 and stayed for 20 years. Where Hatfull was the creative genius and Dean the competition specialist, Webster was the Swiss Army knife of Wickford, designer, draftsman, photographer, trade show representative, engine tester, demonstration flyer, and customer service handler, dealing with many queries from small boys and grown-up boys. He could pick up a balsa component and tell you its exact weight. Years of practice. He designed the EaSA-built range, simplified beginner kits that would become the gateway for a generation, and the Galleon sailing ship series that diversified the product line beyond aircraft. His family lived in one of the company bungalows named Ajax, after the kit. 3 designers. A furniture maker's son with a genius for business. And a country full of boys who wanted to fly. The timing was extraordinary. Britain in the late 1940s was gripped by aviation mania. The Battle of Britain was recent memory. The jet age was dawning. Aeromodeler magazine, founded in 1935, had become the world's leading authority on the hobby and would serve as Keelcraft's primary advertising vehicle for decades. The Society of Model Aeronautical Engineers reported over 500 affiliated clubs. An estimated 500,000 people in Britain were building and flying model aircraft. The infrastructure was vast. Disused wartime airfields, over 600 of them scattered across the country, provided ready-made flying fields. The then Queen and Princess Margaret had visited a model flying gala at Hawkers Langley Airfield in 1948. Lord Brabazon served as SMAE president, presiding over awards dinners at the Dorchester Hotel. This was not a fringe hobby. This was a national enthusiasm with royal patronage and aristocratic endorsement. Keelcraft's competitors were established but vulnerable. Frog, flies right off the ground, had produced rubber-powered flying models since 1932, and had even launched the world's first injection-moulded plastic aircraft kits in 1936. But Frog was pivoting towards static plastic scale models, leaving a gap in the flying model market. Skybirds, which had reached 18,000 members and 600 clubs, had collapsed during the war when metal parts were forbidden. The market for reliable, affordable, well-designed balsa flying model kits was wide open. Eddie Keil drove straight through it. Chapter 3. Balsa Dust and Cellulose. In 1954, Keil Kraft outgrew Hackney Road. Eddie moved the entire operation to Russell Gardens, Wickford, Essex, a small town in the Essex countryside, not far from the Keil family home on Canvey Island. Dudley Webster, Ernie's son, was 5 years old at the time. He remembered his father commuting for a couple of weeks before the family followed. What they found at Russell Gardens wasn't just a factory. Eddie had built a small industrial community. The main building housed the balsa wood workshop, saws, milling machines, dust extraction ducting that would accumulate decades of fine balsa powder. A printing works where Arthur Buck Adams produced the box art, the plans and the annual handbooks. A design office where Hatfull and Webster bent over drafting tables. Plastic injection moulding machines arrived in the mid-1950s for Hurricane parts, and later the 1/72nd scale kits. An engine repair workshop. a dispatch area with racks of boxed kits stretching to the ceiling. A 2-story extension was eventually added to the front of the main building, and alongside it all, Eddie built pairs of bungalows for his key workers, named after his models, Ajax and Achilles. Buck Adams, the printer, lived in a company bungalow called Chilton. The raw material that sustained this world arrived from Ecuador, which produced roughly 95% of the world's balsa wood. Ochroma pyramidale, the lightest commercial timber on Earth, softer than cork in some cuts, with a density that could vary so wildly from piece to piece that sorting by weight was essential. During the war, balsa had been restricted to military use. Civilians built their models from heavier abeche wood. After 1945, the supply chains reopened and the workshops at Russell Gardens received their consignments of raw balsa. Pale, almost weightless planks that Jim Bloomfield cut on his saw, that the milling machines reduced to strips and sheets of precise thickness, and that Buck Adams's printing press stamped with cutting guides directly onto the wood surface. This was the production line that put Wickford on the map. Balsa cut to size, printed with component outlines, gathered together with tissue paper, wire undercarriage parts, propellers, rubber motors, and fittings, then packed into boxes that proclaimed Made in Wickford, Essex, and dispatched to every model shop in the country. The Wickford Community Archive captures it plainly. This model-making company made Wickford famous around the world. But the boxes told only half the story. What happened when a boy got one home and opened it? That was where the magic lived. Inside was a collection of flat balsa sheets with printed outlines, tissue covering, a propeller, rubber strip for the motor, a plan sheet, and an instruction booklet written with the patient clarity of people who understood that their customers were often 12 years old and working alone. The builder cut the components from the sheets with a modelling knife, following the printed lines that Buck Adams had laid down, then assembled a skeleton of ribs and longerons over the plan, pinning each piece in place on a building board. The fuselage went up in halves, joined at the nose and tail. The wing was built flat, then cracked gently at the centre to introduce dihedral, the upward angle that gives a model its stability in flight. Every joint was cemented with balsa cement, the sharp chemical smell of which would follow you through the house for days. Then came the covering. Tissue paper, lightweight, gossamer thin, was water shrunk over the frame, pulling taut across the ribs to create the wing and fuselage surfaces. And then the moment that every builder remembered for the rest of their lives, the application of cellulose dope. 2 coats, brushed on with care, the solvent biting into the tissue and shrinking it drum-tight over the balsa skeleton. The smell was extraordinary, a pungent chemical tang, sweet and sharp simultaneously, that filled the room and soaked into the curtains and announced to every member of the household that a model was being built. Decades later, grown men who hadn't touched balsa since childhood could recall that smell with absolute precision. It was the smell of concentration, of patience, of a 10-year-old's first encounter with the principle that if you rush the work fails. Cellulose dope didn't forgive. It wrinkled if you applied it too thick. It tore through the tissue if you weren't careful. It rewarded only the steady hand. And when you got it right, when the tissue pulled tight and the surfaces gleamed and the whole structure weighed almost nothing in your palm, you'd built something that could actually fly. That was the product, not a toy. An education in patience, precision, and the physics of flight, packaged in a cardboard box and sold for pocket money. 200 people at Russell Gardens produced this education at industrial scale. Men and women, office staff, and factory floor operators, multiple generations of Wickford families. The factory film from the mid-1960s, still viewable today, shows Eddie Keil himself on the floor, workers in jackets and ties, minimal machine guarding that would horrify a modern health and safety inspector, and school children being given tours of the works. A former summer worker from the early 70s remembered, "After 10 minutes training, I was operating a planing machine that reduced balsa planks to a uniform thickness. A number of the older guys had missing fingers." Eddie chain-smoked through it all. Visitors remembered the number of cigarettes he went through. He ran the factory with a hands-on, paternalistic style, calling into employees' bungalows for a haircut from Buck Adams, who was a dab hand at being a barber, as well as the company's printer. Nigel Haddock, son of the sales manager, met Eddie once as a small boy. Apparently I pointed to him and said, "You'll burst." My dad was not pleased. There was also, improbably, a darkroom. Ernie Webster had converted one of the factory toilets. One of the toilets had a worktop alongside a sink, into a photographic developing space, where he produced the images for the annual handbooks. His son Dudley appeared as a child model in handbook photographs and in a Keelcraft advertising film. That film, shot at a London studio, featuring young Dudley buying a kit in a mock model shop, building it, and then flying the finished plane on a bit of bomb site, was reportedly screened at the Odeon Leicester Square. Its current whereabouts are unknown. Dudley later wrote, "I wonder if it still exists." And there was, even more improbably, a set of 3 replica coronation chairs. Eddie had made them, likely for the 1953 coronation of Elizabeth II, using the woodworking skills inherited from 3 generations of Keil cabinet makers. Their whereabouts are also unknown. One turned up years later on the BBC's Bargain Hunt, where the presenter speculated it was a former film prop, not knowing it had been built by the man who ran Britain's largest model aircraft factory. Chapter 4. When nearly every schoolboy built one. 1. By the early 1960s, the range was staggering. Free-flight rubber models, free-flight engine-powered models, tow-line gliders, control-line aircraft, JetX-powered jets, 12 standardised models by the 1969 handbook, from the Avro 707A Delta to the MiG-15, tapping directly into Cold War and space race enthusiasm. Radio control convertible designs. The entire easy-built beginner range. Spitfires, Hurricanes, Messerschmitts, Mustangs, Cessnas, Pipers, typically 15 to 22 inches in wingspan, each one a gateway into the wider Keelcraft world. The easy-built boat range. The Otter Tug, the Triton, the Curlew, the Terrier, the Cresta outboard, set to become, as the company believed, the biggest seller of model boat kits in the country. The Galleon sailing ship series, HMS Revenge, Ark Royal, Bounty, Golden Hind, Mayflower, Santa Maria, in junior 6-inch and senior 12-inch sizes. 1 72nd scale plastic injection moulded kits of Routemaster buses, steam trucks and trams. Their own Cobra Point 049 engines challenging the American Cox. Balsa wood supplies, propellers, rubber motors, cements and tools. The 1963 handbook ran to 92 pages. The total catalogue likely exceeded 200 distinct products. And the models flew. That was the point. An Ajax, properly built and trimmed, would climb on a wound rubber motor in a steady left-hand spiral, transition into a glide, and drift across a field for a minute or more. A Senator, Hatful's masterwork, could consistently exceed 3 minutes, the key competition benchmark. A Junior 60, originally designed for free flight with the Keil K6 petrol engine, proved so inherently stable that it became the standard radio model by the 1950s. The radio modeler turned naturally to a model which had proved itself in the free flight field. Junior 60s are still seen at flying clubs today, almost 80 years after the design was first drawn. That's not nostalgia. That's aerodynamics. The Wickford Community Archive captures the era with a line that isn't hyperbole. The 1950s saw the soaring success of Keelcraft in full flight when nearly every schoolboy must have at least attempted to build a Keelcraft kit. The company was the premier modelling name in the country, perhaps the first name that comes to mind when talking about balsa wood model aircraft, having been market leaders for decades. A Boys' Life survey of Boy Scouts in the early 1960s found that 99% of them built model kits. In Britain, the infrastructure to support this enthusiasm was extraordinary. The SMAE reported 318 affiliated clubs with 8,000 formal members by 1959, plus many thousands more unaffiliated. The Nationals at Sywell drew 1,744 competitors, 456 in open power alone. Flying fields had proliferated across disused wartime airfields. On any given weekend in the late 50s, from the fens to the downs, boys and men stood in fields watching balsa and tissue creations catch thermals and vanish into the sky. The annual Keil Kraft handbook was a document of quiet authority. Published every year from 1946 to 1980, typically running to 90 or more pages, it serves simultaneously as catalogue, building guide, and encyclopedia of the hobby. Articles covered construction techniques, engine selection and tuning, tissue covering methods, radio control basics, finishing and painting, and competition rules. For boys who couldn't afford flying lessons or engineering courses, the handbook was both. An education in applied physics disguised as a hobby catalogue, delivered through your letterbox for the price of a postal order. Keil Kraft kits were sold through every model shop in Britain. The boxes, stamped "Made in Wickford, Essex," carried that small town's name to every high street. Export markets stretched to Norway, New Zealand, Canada, Australia and Brazil. Ernie Webster represented the company at trade shows in the Royal Horticultural Halls in London, with young Dudley in tow. At the peak, Keil Kraft was the dominant British manufacturer of balsa wood flying model kits, occupying the same position in the flying model market that Airfix held in the static kit world. Brighton Toy Museum's assessment is definitive. Keil Kraft were the major supplier of balsa wood model aircraft kits in the UK after World War II. The pipeline from those kits to real careers was not metaphorical. One man who built and flew Keil Kraft Senators as a boy became a Rolls-Royce and General Electric engineer. Another built a Keil Kraft air coupe as a teenager, found himself sufficiently enthused by modelling experiences and the idea of engineering in general to pursue a degree in aerospace engineering at the University of Hertfordshire, and went on to design wind tunnels. Dave Platt, who flew on the English International Control Line stunt team in 1957, captured the educational power plainly. From the age of 10 in 1944, I gobbled up every copy of Aero Modeller. From its pages, I learned everything about geometry, mathematics, geography, physics, chemistry. A boy could learn more from a single copy of Aero Modeller than from a year's worth of schooling. He wasn't exaggerating. The skills involved in building a balsa model were not trivial. You learned about wing camber, the curve of the aerofoil section that generates lift. You learned about dihedral, the upward angle of the wings that provides lateral stability. You learned about centre of gravity, too far forward and the model dives, too far back and it stalls. You learned about thrust lines, the angle of the propeller shaft relative to the wing. And you learned, the hard way, about the consequences of poor craftsmanship. Your model crashes. A generation of British engineers received their first practical education in aerodynamic principles not in a classroom but in a spare bedroom, with a Keil Kraft box and a tube of balsa cement and the sharp reek of cellulose dope seeping under the door. The founders of aviation itself had followed the same path. A V. Rowe, Sir Richard Fairey, Sir Frank Whittle, all model flyers. F.J. Cam, who named the Society of Model Aeronautical Engineers, was the brother of Sidney Cam, designer of the Hawker Hurricane. Both were model builders. Across the Atlantic, Neil Armstrong was a member of an Academy of Model Aeronautics club. The line from a Keil Kraft Ajax to an aerospace career was not a sentimental fiction. It was a documented reality, repeated thousands of times. Chapter 5. The Summit Before the Fall. By the mid-1960s, everything Eddie Keil had built was in place. 200 workers, over 200 products, export markets, on 5 continents. A design team whose models had collectively sold in the millions. An annual handbook that had become an institution. A factory that had put Wickford on the map. A brand name that was, in its market, as dominant and as trusted as any in British manufacturing. Eddie himself was still there. Still chain-smoking on the factory floor, still flying competition models, still visiting workers in their bungalows for a cup of tea and a haircut from Buck Adams. Still, in his own quiet way, the gravitational centre around which everything at Russell Gardens orbited. The Keil Kraft advertising film had screened at the Odeon Leicester Square. The annual handbook sat in a pile on the design office shelf, 1946, 1947, 1948, all the way through to the current edition, a paper record of 2 decades of unbroken production and innovation. Albert Hatfield's Ajax had passed its millionth kit. Bill Dean had emigrated to America in 1953, but Ernie Webster was still there, designing, photographing, demonstrating, answering letters from small boys and grown-up boys, holding the operational fabric of the company together with the quiet competence of a man who'd been doing the job for 20 years. The wider hobby was at its absolute zenith. Model shops occupied every high street. Flying clubs met every weekend. The Nationals drew nearly 2,000 competitors. The cultural ecosystem, Aero Modeler magazine, the SMAE, the trade shows, the handbooks, functioned as a self-reinforcing system that generated new customers faster than they aged out. British aero modelling was not merely healthy, it was thriving on a scale that would, within 15 years, seem almost unbelievable. And there was no reason, standing at Russell Gardens in 1965 and looking out across the Essex countryside, to think any of it would end. Eddie Keil had built his company on 3 things: craft knowledge inherited from a German cabinet maker, commercial instinct sharpened by competition flying, and the quiet paternalism of a man who named his workers' houses after his models. The first couldn't be taught, the second couldn't be inherited, and the third would die with him. On the evening of November the 13th, 1968, Eddie Keil was driving on the A127 Southend arterial road near Warley Street. A lorry tried to cross the dual carriageway. Eddie's Jaguar went straight under the trailer. He was killed instantly. A former employee remembered the day. "I well remember the day Eddie Keil was killed in a road accident. I seem to remember a lorry tried to cross the A127 and Eddie's Jag went straight under the trailer. A very sad time." The Brentwood Gazette reported the death on November the 15th. A 50-year-old man, though the ages in the records don't quite agree, killed on a road he'd driven 1,000 times, on a November evening, less than 20 miles from the factory he'd built, and the bungalows he'd named, and the 200 people whose livelihoods depended on the commercial instinct that died with him on the tarmac. Everything that came after would be momentum. The brand carried forward by the force of what Eddie had built, but with no one at the centre who understood, as he had, both the wood and the flight. Chapter 6. 2 Departures. The decline of Keil Kraft can be traced to a precise 2-year window. 2 losses arriving in sequence that removed the creative and commercial heart of the company in a single stroke. In 1966, Ernie Webster left. 20 years at Russell Gardens. Designing, photographing, demonstrating, answering the post, converting toilets into darkrooms, picking up balsa components and telling you their weight by feel. And then he was gone. He retrained as a teacher, first at a school in Wickford, then as head of art at John O'Gaunt School in Hungerford, Berkshire. A quiet departure. No drama. A man in his early 40s who looked at the trajectory of his career and chose a different one. The consequences were immediate and permanent. The easy-built range, the beginner kits that served as the entry point for a generation, the boat kits that the company believed were poised to become the biggest-selling model boat range in the country, was never further developed, not scaled back, not handed to a lesser designer, simply frozen in place. No replacement of comparable versatility was hired. Webster had been the man who did everything. When he walked out of Russell Gardens for the last time, the company lost its photographer, its trade show face, its customer service voice, its boat designer, its easy-built architect, and a working memory of how every department connected to every other. The creative engine lost one of its 2 cylinders. Then, 2 years later, it lost the driver. November the 13th, 1968, the A127 Southend Arterial Road near Warley Street. A lorry crossing the dual carriageway. Eddie Keil's Jaguar going underneath the trailer at speed. The Brentwood Gazette reported it 2 days later. A former employee's memory was specific and lasting. "I well remember the day Eddie Keil was killed in a road accident. I seem to remember a lorry tried to cross the A127 and Eddie's Jag went straight under the trailer. A very sad time. Eddie wasn't just the managing director. He was the commercial instinct. The competition flyer who understood what his customers wanted because he was one of them. The paternalist who built houses for his workers and chain-smoked through conversations on the factory floor. The man who'd named the gypsy after Bill Dean's bohemian appearance and made coronation chairs in his spare time, and visited America, and come home with an idea that became an empire. Everything about Keil Kraft, its product range, its feel, its relationship with its market, flowed from Eddie's understanding of what a boy with a box of balsa wood actually needed. That understanding could not be written down, filed in a cabinet, or passed to the next man. The next man was Ken Keil, Eddie's half-brother, son of Edward Keil Sr.'s third marriage to Violet Elsie Bunnett. Ken had grown up on Canvey Island, attended Billericay Secondary School, and completed an engineering apprenticeship. A childhood friend recalled that Ken inherited the Keelcraft firm which he ran in Wickford with 200 staff. He was, by every account, a decent man who found himself in charge of a company whose animating genius had died on the tarmac of the A127. He ran the business. He kept the doors open. He maintained production. But the spark that had driven Keil Kraft from a furniture workshop in Shoreditch to dominance of the British model aircraft market, that was Eddie's, and it was gone. The 1970s at Russell Gardens were a decade of quiet contraction. Production continued. Some new designs appeared, Jim Bagley's Aquarius in 1973, an out-and-out contest sailplane, and the Super 60 in 1975, a modernised Junior 60 for radio control, co-designed by Webster's successor P. Rogers. Roger Tarry joined around 1970 as an engine repair specialist, and later moved to the plastic moulding machines and the drawing room, building models for trade shows. Eddie Koch supervised the factory floor. The machinery still ran. The saws still cut. But the range contracted rather than expanded. Metal propellers in kits were quietly replaced with cheaper plastic ones, a small economy that the modelers noticed and the accountants didn't. The easy-built range sat undeveloped. And the annual handbook, that institution, that paper monument to 20 years of unbroken production, published its final edition in 1980. 34 years of handbooks ended without ceremony. The 1980 edition was the last thing Keil Kraft ever said to its customers in its own voice. Chapter 7. The 5 Headwinds. Even with Eddie alive, even with Hatfull still at his drafting table and Webster still answering the post, Keil Kraft would have faced headwinds that no amount of commercial instinct could have entirely overcome. What made the decline tragic, rather than merely unfortunate, was that these forces arrived together, reinforcing each other, at precisely the moment when the company had lost the people best equipped to navigate them. The first headwind was plastic. By the mid-1970s, Airfix alone sold 20 million kits per year and commanded 75% of the entire UK model kit market. Their distribution model was devastating. Mass production, competitive pricing, and placement in Woolworths. The chain store where every family in Britain shopped. An Airfix Spitfire cost pocket money and took an afternoon. A Keelcraft Spitfire cost more, took days of careful construction, required balsa cement and cellulose dope and tissue paper and a modelling knife and a building board. And at the end of it, you had something fragile that might fly beautifully or might nosedive into a hedge. The Airfix kit sat on a shelf and looked impressive. The Keelcraft kit required commitment. For a generation of boys increasingly accustomed to instant results, the calculus was shifting. The second headwind was radio control. The affordable digital proportional RC systems, emerging from the late 1960s, transformed the hobby from free flight and control line to radio-controlled flight. This was, in principle, an opportunity. RC was more engaging, more controllable, more visually spectacular than watching a free flight model drift away on a thermal. But Keil Kraft never meaningfully pivoted. The company remained anchored in its traditional free flight and control line products, the models that had built its reputation in the 1940s and 50s, while the market reorganized itself around a technology that demanded entirely different designs, different materials, and different price points. The Junior 60 had been adapted for RC, and the Super 60 followed. But these were conversions of existing airframes, not purpose-built radio control aircraft, designed from scratch for the new market. The company was retrofitting the past instead of designing the future. The third headwind was Japan. Companies like Tamiya produced kits with finer moulding detail, superior engineering, tighter tolerances, and competitive pricing. The Japanese manufacturers didn't just undercut British producers on cost, they outperformed them on quality. For a hobby that had always prized precision, this was a direct challenge to the assumption that British-made meant best. The fourth headwind was cost. Balsa wood prices rose through the 1970s, partly driven by the oil crisis that inflated shipping and transport costs across the global supply chain. Ecuador's balsa plantations hadn't changed, but the cost of getting the wood from the plantation to the workshop in Wickford had. Kit prices crept upward at precisely the moment when cheaper alternatives, plastic kits, foam models, and eventually ready-to-fly imports, were pulling prices down. The fifth headwind was cultural, and it was the most destructive of all. Television had been competing for children's attention since the 1950s, but by the late 70s and early 80s, the competition intensified catastrophically. Video games arrived. The ZX Spectrum and the Commodore 64 arrived. The Sony Walkman arrived. Each one offered immediate gratification, a hit of entertainment that required no craft, no patience, no 40 hours of careful construction, no understanding of dihedral or thrust lines. The Smithsonian's Air and Space magazine captured the shift bluntly. Interest in hands-on model building dwindled during the 1970s and cratered in the 80s with the introduction of video games and the Sony Walkman. A boy who might have spent a week building a Senator in 1962 was, by 1982, playing Space Invaders. The cultural ecosystem that had sustained Keil Kraft, the model shops, the clubs, the magazines, the flying fields, the assumption that building things with your hands was a normal part of boyhood, was being dismantled by forces that no single company, however well led, could have resisted. And beneath all five headwinds, a sixth force was at work: the slow death of the independent model shop. Keil Kraft's primary retail channel, the specialist hobby shop on every British high street, staffed by enthusiasts who could explain the difference between an Ajax and a Senator and recommend the right cement for a beginner, was disappearing. Chain stores didn't stock balsa kits. Supermarkets didn't stock balsa kits. The shops that did were closing, one by one, year by year, as high street rents rose and footfall declined. The distribution network that had carried those made in Wickford, Essex boxes to every corner of the country was contracting at the same rate as the customer base. Each of these forces was survivable in isolation. Together, arriving simultaneously, compounding each other's effects, they were not. Chapter 8. The Silence Moves. In the factory at Russell Gardens ceased manufacturing in the early 1980s. There was no single day of closure, no picket line, no front-page headline. The work simply wound down. Production slowing, orders thinning, the workforce shrinking through natural attrition and quiet redundancies until the day came when the saws stopped and nobody restarted them. The last handbook in 1980 marks the end of active product development. After that, Keil Kraft was a brand without a voice. Existing stock was assembled, boxed, and dispatched. New designs were not commissioned. The machinery that had cut and milled and printed for 30 years ran less and less frequently, then not at all. In 1984, the balsa wood workshop was sold. The buyer, who later posted his account online, described the purchase and an incidental meeting. In 1984, I bought the Keelcraft balsa wood workshop in Wickford to use for my double glazing company. I did meet with Ken Keil some years ago, who coincidentally also ran a double glazing company. There is a detail in that sentence that carries its own weight. The man who inherited Britain's premier model aircraft company and the man who bought its workshop both ended up in double glazing. The trajectory from balsa dust to UPVC window frames is, in miniature, the trajectory of British craft manufacturing in the late 20th century. When the buyer removed the dust extraction ducting from the workshop, he got totally covered with sawdust. Decades of fine balsa dust, the physical residue of 1,000,000 Ajaxes, 1,000,000 Senators, 1,000,000 afternoons of careful cutting and milling and sorting by weight, had accumulated in the system. It came down on him like the memory of something the building had been trying to hold on to. No documented worker resistance exists. No formal closure announcement has been found. No public protest. The factory appears to have simply faded, its workers drifting to other employment in ones and twos, the machinery falling silent, the bungalows on Russell Gardens continuing to stand with their names, Ajax and Achilles, increasingly meaningless to the people who lived in them. When Les Cook, a former worker, died, his family found bags and bags of balsa wood in his garage. He'd taken the material home. Whether as a practical reserve or as something he simply couldn't bear to leave behind isn't recorded. Keil Kraft was not alone in this. The same arc, golden age, contraction, silence, was playing out across the entire British aeromodelling industry, almost simultaneously. Frog, flies right off the ground, had been part of Lines Brothers, one of the largest toy companies in the world. Lines Brothers entered receivership in 1971. The Frog brand was acquired by Dunby Convex Marks in 1972. The last Frog-branded kits were produced in 1976. In a final humiliation, the moulds were sold to the Soviet Union and marketed as the Novo brand. Axis aircraft moulds went to Revell. Japanese aircraft moulds to Hasegawa. A company that had produced the world's first injection-moulded plastic model aircraft kits, in 1936, ended up dispersed across 3 continents, its tooling outlasting its identity. Veron, founded by Vera and Ronald, the name a portmanteau of their own, had been Keil Kraft's closest rival in the balsa kit market. Designer Phil Smith had created approximately 300 designs over 34 years, including the Impala 52 slope soarer, which sold 140,000 kits and probably introduced more people to the delights of slope soaring than any other model. Veron was sold to Amarang in 1978 amid difficult trading conditions, with hopes for a renaissance of the kit range fading amidst rumours of large stocks of unsold kits being dumped. Smith retired in 1981 and died in 2010. His son Colin maintains the plans service. The designs survived. The company didn't. Perhaps the most painful parallel was ED Engines, electronic developments of Surrey. Founded in 1946 by 65 former Parnell Aircraft Company workers, each of whom invested £50, roughly $3,000 in today's money. A genuine workers' cooperative born from redundancy, built on collective risk. Based at Villiers Road, Kingston upon Thames, designed by Basil Miles, they produced over 300,000 EDB engines and came close to dominating the British model engine market. Then, in 1963, a catastrophic fire destroyed their premises and most of their engine dies. A devastating back tax bill from a failed purchase tax challenge compounded the blow. They rebuilt. They never recovered. 65 men who'd each staked £50 on a shared belief that they could build something. And a fire took it away. The structural causes were the same across every case. Asian manufacturing undercut British producers on price. Independent model shops disappeared from high streets. Cultural priorities shifted from making to consuming. Ready-to-fly and almost ready-to-fly models manufactured in China from the 1990s onward delivered the final blow to the build-from-scratch ethos. Why spend 40 hours constructing a fragile balsa frame when you could buy a foam RC plane, ready to fly for less money? The question answered itself, and with it answered the reason for Keelcraft's existence. Chapter 9. The Brand Without a Body. After Wickford closed, the Keelcraft name entered a strange afterlife. A brand passed from hand to hand, each owner more distant from the original than the last, like a family heirloom circulating through an auction house. The brand and remaining stock transferred to Amarang Limited, located at Commerce Way, Lancing Business Park, West Sussex. Production was sporadic at best. A visitor to the Salabo building on the Lancing estate in the late 1990s noticed the Keelcraft logo in the window and was told that a former Keilcraft employee would come in occasionally and print off some kits from time to time. Occasionally. From time to time. One person, alone, in a building that wasn't Russell Gardens, producing kits that weren't being designed by Hatfull or Webster or anyone who'd known Eddie Keil. The Easybuilt range was likely withdrawn around 1995. Amarang became the wholesale arm of the Model Zone Group, formerly Model Aerodrome, renamed Model Zone in 1999. Model Zone expanded aggressively, opening 47 retail stores by 2012. The expansion, in the assessment of those who watched it happen, was disastrous. The company had bet on high street retail at precisely the moment when high street retail was collapsing under the weight of online competition and rising rents. On June the 26th, 2013, Model Zone Holdings, Amarang Group, Model Zone Limited and Amarang Limited all entered administration simultaneously. Richard Hawes, Nicholas Edwards and Robert Harding of Deloitte were appointed joint administrators. At the point of collapse, 47 branches, 385 employees, a chain that had tried to build the modern equivalent of the model shop High Street and discovered that the High Street no longer existed. On July the 17th, 2013, Ripmax Limited bought Amarang, including the Keil Kraft brand rights, through a newly incorporated company called Pinehurst 104 Limited. All 18 remaining Amarang employees were transferred. 18. Not 200. 18. Deloitte's Richard Hawes stated that they were delighted to have secured a buyer for Amarang, which continues to be an attractive brand given the strength of its customer and supplier base. The remaining Model Zone stores closed by mid-September. W.H. Smith acquired the Model Zone name in October. The physical retail network that had connected Keelcraft kits to customers for 40 years was, by autumn 2013, completely gone. Ripmax itself had a certain symmetry with the story. Founded on April the 7th, 1949, as a joint venture between Charles A. Rippon and Max Coote, Rip plus Max, it had started as Everyman's Model Shop in Camden Town, selling model boat equipment. 2 men, a shop, a passion for models. Not so different from Eddie Keil and a ceiling full of rubber-powered aircraft in a Shoreditch furniture workshop. Ripmax had grown into one of the UK's largest wholesalers of RC models and accessories, now based at Ripmax Corner in Enfield, employing over 70 staff. Their slogan, "If it's Ripmax, it's good," carried an echo of the same maker's confidence that had driven Keelcraft in its prime. In 2018, Ripmax relaunched the Keelcraft brand with a curated selection of classic designs. The Ace, the Ajax, the Senator, the Gypsy, the Caprice, and the Invader. Every design was carefully redrawn in CAD with laser-cut components for a quick build and a precision fit. The printed-on balsa method, where builders cut their own parts from sheets using the lines that Buck Adams had laid down on his printing press, was gone, replaced by laser-cut precision that eliminated the craft of cutting and fitting and replaced it with clean, machine-perfect components that slotted together like a jigsaw. Ripmax's own marketing captured the tension honestly. The world has marched on into radio control and ARTF, but there is also a growing nostalgia market. Nostalgia. The word does the work quietly. These kits are not sold to 12-year-old boys discovering flight for the first time. They're sold to 60-year-old men remembering it. The Ajax costs £20 odd from a handful of specialist retailers. The Senator is in the catalogue. The Invader, Hatfull's first design, the twin-fin glider he drew while recovering from polio, is back in production 75 years after its debut. But the customer has changed. The purpose has changed. The ecosystem that gave these kits their meaning, the model shops, the clubs, the flying fields, the assumption that a boy should know how to build something with his hands, has largely gone. Chapter 10. Balsa dust in the ductwork. The factory buildings at Russell Gardens, Wickford, Essex, SS118QU, still stand. The main balsa wood workshop now has a 2-storey extension on the front. Newly built light industrial units are being let at the location. Electric roller shutter doors, 3-phase power supply, EV charging points. The most common recorded business type is workshop and warehouse. A company called Rackmaster Limited, which makes machinery for food and drink processing, occupies part of the site. The air smells of nothing in particular. The floor doesn't shake. There is no sound of saws or printing presses or the particular hiss of a dust extraction system pulling balsa powder through aluminium ducting. The bungalows Eddie Keil built for his workers, the ones he named Ajax and Achilles, are still standing on Russell Gardens. Nobody living in them knows why they carry those names. There is no plaque, no marker, no blue plaque for Eddie Keil anywhere in Wickford, or on Canvey Island, or on Hackney Road in Shoreditch, where the model aircraft hung from the ceiling of a furniture workshop. No Wikipedia article for the company. No dedicated book. No permanent exhibition in any museum, though Brighton Toy and Model Museum holds items and catalogues, and the Outer Zone database archives 144 Keelcraft plans, a digital preservation of the designs themselves, the geometry of Hatful's genius saved in downloadable PDFs. The memory survives in fragments. The Wickford Community Archive maintains a page that has become an informal memorial. Vivid testimonies from former workers, family members and customers, contributed over years by people who found the site and recognised something they'd been carrying. The Canvey Island Community Archive hosts the Keil family genealogy, maintained by Derek Keil, Eddie's nephew, with contributions from relatives in Australia, Canada and the UK. The Model Plans website hosts the Ernie Webster Memorial page, with factory photographs from 1961 and Dudley Webster's quiet, detailed recollections of a childhood spent in and around the works. The factory film survives on YouTube. The advertising film, the one screened at the Odeon Leicester Square featuring Dudley buying a kit in a mock shop and flying a model on a bomb site, has not been found. On eBay, the collector market is active. 800 or more listings for Keelcraft models at any given time. An original Ladybird kit in good condition fetches £200. A rare K6 Spark ignition engine from 1946 sells for £170. A sealed Mint Fairy Gannet kit goes for £45. One collector described his stash of original Cobra Point O, 4.9 engines and an unmade Mercury P38 kit as the pride and joy of my collection. These are artefacts now, objects from a world that has closed. The British Model Flying Association, successor to the SMAE, the organisation whose clubs and competitions had formed the backbone of Keelcraft's market, reports approximately 30,000 members with over 750 affiliated clubs. But membership is declining. The organisation's own 2024 fee announcement acknowledged reducing membership numbers and proposed significant cuts in expenditure. It now incorporates British drone flyers in an attempt to capture a market that has nothing to do with balsa wood or cellulose dope, or the patient craft of building something that weighs almost nothing and might, if you've done everything right, catch a thermal and climb until it's a speck against the clouds. Small signs of life remain. The Vintage Model Company, formed in 2012, is now the biggest manufacturer of balsa aircraft in the UK, with over 200 unique kits, all made in Britain using laser cutting and modern CAD. Henson's Hobbies near Bristol designs and manufactures balsa kits with laser-cut parts and 3D printed components. During the COVID-19 lockdowns, adults returned to balsa model building in measurable numbers. The enforced stillness, the absence of distraction, creating a brief window in which the patience required to build a balsa model suddenly aligned with the patience the world was demanding. But these are niche markets driven by middle-aged remembering, not new generations discovering. Chapter 11. The Weight of What Was Lost. A German cabinet maker emigrates to Hackney in 1864. His grandson grows up above a furniture workshop in Shoreditch, where model aircraft hang from the ceiling. The grandson visits America, watches his father build the wooden mosquito, and comes home with an idea. He hires a boy with polio-damaged hands who turns out to be a genius. He hires a bohemian in sandals who pioneers rocket-powered models. He hires a quiet man who can tell you the weight of a balsa component by touch. He builds a factory in Essex, names the workers' houses after his models, and produces 200 different products that teach 500,000 boys the physics of flight. He chain smokes. He makes coronation chairs. He drives a Jaguar. Then a lorry crosses the A127 on a November evening. Everything that came after was momentum, the brand carried forward by the force of what Eddie had built, but slowing. The ease-built range, frozen. The handbooks, ending. The metal propellers, replaced with plastic. The model shops, closing. The boys, turning to screens. The saws at Russell Gardens, falling silent one by one until the silence was all that was left. And a man bought the workshop for his double glazing company and got covered in 30 years of balsa dust when he pulled down the extraction ducting. The bungalows are still called Ajax and Achilles. Nobody remembers why. The brand name survives, laser cut in CAD, sold online, marketed to nostalgia. Brighton Toy Museum holds the catalogues. The Outer Zone database holds the plans. eBay holds the kits, priced in pounds rather than pocket money. Somewhere in those walls at Russell Gardens, if you knocked through the plaster, you might still find balsa dust in the ductwork. The residue of 1,000,000 kits. The residue of a generation's education in flight, patience, and the understanding that if you rush the work fails. Not through one disaster, through a slow accumulation of absences. A designer who left, a founder who died, a market that shifted, a culture that forgot what it meant to build something with your hands and watch it fly. Until the hooter stopped sounding and the gates closed, and a factory that had taught a generation to understand the air became a warehouse with EV charging points and electric roller shutter doors. And there was no plaque.